Friday, the 25th of June, 1982. A young woman fails to show up for work, and her lifeless body is discovered in her hotel room.
She's about to start a new job as food services director at a hospital in Council Bluffs.
Lee died from a single knife wound to the heart, inflicted from the front, and may have been dead up to 12 hours before her body was discovered.
The motel's proximity to two busy interstate highways presented a problem for investigators.
By the time the officer showed up on the scene, the suspect could have been theoretically anywhere in the country by that point.
More than 2 weeks after the murder, police still have no motive, no witnesses, and no suspects.
The Rotatory murder case was growing colder by the day.
Our goal is to, try to bring justice to the loved ones of this victim.
It would be another unsolved murder, one 550 miles away, that would hold the key, almost 40 years later, to discovering who killed Lee Rotatory.
The unsolved ones, we have to stand up
and approach these cases in a way outside the box.
Let the world know, is those out there that did commit a murder, there are people that are coming after you.
There's just a lot of good people trying to do the right thing.
Because it's something that you have to be passionate about.
Solve this, bring some peace to the family at least. I was just doing my job.
When Lee Rotatory fails to show up for work on Friday, June 25th, 1982, her employer calls the front desk of the motel that she's staying at.
She's about to start a new job as food services director at a hospital in Council Bluffs, a city on the banks of the Missouri River.
Lee just arrived from Michigan and checks into the motel. This is prior to beginning a week of orientation at the hospital.
But sometime in the early hours of Friday, June 25th, 32-year-old Lee Rotatory is stabbed to death in her motel room. Police are alerted after her body is discovered by motel staff at 12:27 p.m. The police have no murder weapon and no suspects. By the time Lee's body was found, the killer could have been 1,000 miles away.
The interstate system literally runs right past the hotel where this took place. So by the time the officer showed up on the scene, the suspect could have been theoretically anywhere in the country by that point. So your suspect pool is pretty broad at the time.
3 weeks earlier, Lee visits Council Bluffs for a look around. She likes what she sees and decides to accept the post of food service director at Jenny Edmondson Hospital.
She had come here approximately a week before to start the new job. Her husband stayed behind in Michigan to tidy up some loose ends. They were working on transporting their mobile home from Michigan to Council Bluffs.
Lee begins her orientation training at Jenny Edmondson Hospital on Monday, June 21st. On Thursday, the 24th, she's invited by some of her new colleagues to spend a few hours boating on Lake Manawa in the southern part of the city. The group disperses at dusk. It's close to the longest day of the year, so sunset is relatively late in the evening.
On the way back to the motel, Lee stops at Manawa McDonald's and picks up food to take back to her room. As it turns out, the employees at the restaurant are probably the last ones to see her alive.
Council Bluffs Police Captain Eldon Jones, head of the Criminal Investigation Unit, states that Lee's body was found on the bed, face up and dressed in sleepwear. She was registered alone at the motel. Her car was in the motel's parking lot.
Lee died from a single knife wound to the heart, inflicted from the front, and may have been dead up to 12 hours before her body was discovered.
The county medical examiner says the murder could have been sexually motivated, but Captain Jones says there's no evidence to point to that, and a further autopsy will be needed.
In fact, the police were sitting on substantial evidence that supported the medical examiner's remark.
Her hands had been bound behind her back. Adhesive residue had been found on her eyes and mouth, indicating they had been taped. There was evidence she had been sexually assaulted.
The police have had good reason for not wanting to disclose the sexual assault, but it also could have just been the practice of the times. 40 years ago, things were not disclosed to the degree that they are today. Back then, there was a sense that keeping certain details out of the news would spare the family some anguish.
Although Lee's room had not been overturned, there were some items missing.
The officers at the time didn't know what was missing from the room, but after interviewing with Lee's husband, he reported that her wedding ring, engagement ring, there was a sapphire ring, her watch, including some credit cards, were all missing from the room. Was that the intention of the person that came into her room? Was it to rob her and steal her bag, or was it something else? And in looking over all of the evidence, to me, it appears more that the theft of the items were more of an afterthought or a smokescreen to maybe try to cover up what was really going on there.
On Tuesday, June 29th, the Michigan State Police in Grand Haven joined the investigation into Lee's death and began checking into her background.
Lee joined Service Master in 1980, and her first assignment was a hospital in Michigan. They would later place her at Jenny Edmondson Hospital in Council Bluffs.
At the age of 21, while still an undergraduate, Lee marries Anthony Rotatori on November 14th, 1970, in Olmsted, Minnesota. They have a son, Michael.
Throughout the 70s, Lee works in Wisconsin as a dietitian. She later gets her master's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Monomoy.
But the Rotatori's marriage ends September 1977 when Lee and Anthony divorce in Rockford, Illinois. A little less than a year later, on August 15th, 1978, Lee marries Jerry Nemke in Madison, Wisconsin.
Jerry Stanley Nemke and Lee marry in 1978. They divorce the next year and then remarry in 1981. She keeps her maiden name, Rotatori, for professional reasons, and for her son, who lives with his father in Chicago.
In October of 1980, when Lee is working at Hackley Hospital in nearby Muskegon, she and Jerry move into a mobile home in Crockery Estates, a mobile home park in Nunica.
It was a happy time for Lee. She owned a horse, which she stabled with friends nearby.
Lee had a dog there and owned a couple of pigs, some turkeys, and chickens, and also had a part of the garden at their farm.
In June of 1982, when Lee takes the job in Council Bluffs, the plan is for Jerry to pull up stakes in Nunica and move the mobile home 600 miles west to Iowa.
On Friday, July 1st, Lee's family holds a memorial for her in Rochester, Minnesota, where Lee's younger sister Ann was still living. On July 2nd, authorities announced a $2,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and indictment of the person or persons responsible for the murder of Lee Rotatori. By the 4th of July, it totals $3,000, but still hadn't led to a suspect or motive.
This could be very useful to an investigation. Making an appeal to the public by offering a reward opens the possibility that someone may come forward with information.
Generally, in a case like this, you always try to look at family first, friends and associates after that, and then you start looking for unknowns or outside your scope of friends group for potential suspects. Well, Lee came here from from Michigan. She had only been here a week. She didn't have family here. She didn't have really friends here. She just had met a couple of coworkers that she had been spending a little bit of time with. So the suspect pool was, ginormous.
More than 2 weeks after the murder, police still have no motive, no witnesses, and no suspects.
Shortly after arriving in Council Bluffs, Iowa, to start a new job, 32-year-old Lee Rotatori is discovered dead in her motel room. Detectives find no weapon at the scene. The room is orderly, with no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a forced entry, and with no evidence of a robbery. The police are perplexed.
Lee was not a victim of circumstance. I mean, this wasn't just something that happened, a robbery gone bad, and that she was killed because of that. To me, the evidence more points to this was planned, not only planned, but well planned. So it's not like somebody came in and broke the door down and forced his way into the room. Lee was tied up. Her arms were bound behind her back. Her mouth was taped and her eyes were taped. She was sexually assaulted and then murdered. It was a well-placed one stab wound directly to the heart through 2 chambers of her heart. The subject then took the time to remove the ligatures around her wrists, remove the tape from her mouth, remove the tape from her eyes, collect the knife. He took all the evidence with him. The suspect came with everything he needed to commit the crime of murder, and he left with everything that he used to commit the crime of murder.
During the post-mortem, a sexual assault kit was done. The use of DNA in criminal cases was brand new at the time. Police realized they were in possession of critical evidence, but the technology around analyzing it just wasn't there yet.
That was the key to everything. I mean, without the DNA that was collected at that time during the autopsy, this case would still be cold today.
A little less than 3 months before Lee's death, there had been another fatal stabbing of a young woman in Council Bluffs. In the early hours on the morning of April 9th, 21-year-old Linda Mayfield was stabbed to death in the parking lot of the Starlight Motel at 3320 West Broadway.
The area attracts people from across the river after the bars in Omaha closed for the night.
Linda Mayfield suffered several stab wounds to her face, chest, stomach, hand, and foot. She died shortly after an ambulance took her to Mercy Hospital.
By the end of the year, Linda Mayfield and Lee Rotatori's homicides are still unsolved. 2 of 3 unsolved murders in Council Bluffs in 1982. A place where police prided themselves on clearing their crimes.
Council Bluffs Police Chief Eldon Jones is still hopeful 8 months after Mayfield's murder that police will catch her killer. He's not as optimistic about the Rotatori case. Katie Petit is the crime lab manager and property manager for the Council Bluffs Police Department.
We service the community in Council Bluffs, and sometimes we do assist surrounding agencies. We work anything from small crimes like burglaries, criminal mischief, property damage accidents, all the way up to obviously cases like homicides, cold cases, crimes against person, things like that. To my knowledge, we have all of the evidence that was collected back then. We have a lot of her clothing and things like that. She'd been staying in the hotel for a little while, so we have all of that stuff too. We did have some fingerprints that were lifted from the scene. As much as we talk about advancements in technology, law enforcement has always been, an innovative field. And while a lot of things have changed, I think a lot of things have been similar and stayed the same. But those guys did a great job in their processing, in their documentation of the scene, evidence collection.
On the floor, there is green foam, the kind that a florist would use.
Kind of like when you walked in, almost in the walkway, the entryway to the room. like hundreds of little bitty pieces. It looked like the foam that you stick flowers in, you know, when you receive a flower delivery. So that's definitely interesting. I've never been to a scene where I found floral foam. Just an odd piece of evidence for sure.
The green foam was also found in the upstairs hallway.
Almost every case we work, we have, you know, video surveillance of some sort. But I mean, in the 80s, that wasn't a key piece of evidence. But now, for sure, we would have shown this guy walking down the hallway and walking into a room or dropping floral foam or gotten a license plate off of a vehicle in the parking lot. And that technology just wasn't available back then. So, you know, maybe back then, if we had had that, they would have caught him right away. But that just didn't happen, so.
The Rotatori murder case was growing colder by the day. 4 months after Lee Rotatori is murdered in a Council Bluffs motel room, the decomposing body of a man is found in an isolated wooded area 550 miles away. But it will be 4 decades till investigators are able to uncover the connection between them. On June 25, 1982, 32-year-old Lee Rotatori is stabbed to death in a motel room in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Police have no suspects, no witnesses, no motive in the murder of the young nutritionalist who had arrived from Michigan a week earlier to take up a new post at Jenny Edmondson Hospital. The motel's proximity to 2 busy interstate highways presented a problem for investigators, since the killer could have long been gone by the time police arrived at the scene. Lee's husband remained at their home in Unica while she got her feet on the ground in Council Bluffs. Lee had married Jerry Nemke in 1978. They divorced the following year and then remarried at the end of 1981.
But Jerry Nemke had a past. In May 1960, when he was 17 years old, Nemke was picked up in Chicago by police for questioning in the slaying of 3 Chicago area women and the fatal beating of a young Chicago waitress by the name of Marilyn Duncan on April 29th.
He was a fugitive from a youth camp and was driving a stolen car when he met Duncan and reportedly went out on a date that night.
Nemke was accused of bludgeoning her before leaving her bleeding and unconscious behind a Chicago factory. She died 2 days later. Could he be responsible for Lee's death?
You know, she was raped and then beaten to death, which, you know, heightens your sense of, oh my God, what are the odds of that, you know, to begin with.
But Lee's husband was a long way away on the night of her murder.
He was a 10-hour drive away. In reading through the reports, his alibi was like rock solid.
Nemke had been sentenced to death for the murder of Marilyn Duncan. But less than 2 years later, in January 1962, the Illinois Supreme Court overturned the conviction on the grounds the preliminary hearing had not been properly conducted.
There's a second trial. He's found guilty again and sentenced to 75 years in prison. But then he's released in 1978, and he attends Southern Illinois University in Carbondale.
Nemke's violent past remains a flag for Steve Andrews. 4 months after Lee Rotatori's death, another grisly murder is in the news. On October 30th, human remains are found in a shallow grave in an isolated wooded area outside Cobden, Illinois. It takes 2 weeks to identify the body. Thomas Freeman had been shot 4 times in the chest sometime during July or August.
4 months outdoors in the summer heat would make the victim's body in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult. Dental records are typically the place to start if there is no identification found with the remains.
35-year-old Freeman was from West Frankfort in southern Illinois. He was believed to be a transient, living in different locations. As with Lee's case, police are stymied as to the motive for his murder and have no suspects. It's now 2001. Investigators decide to resubmit DNA taken into evidence from Lee's postmortem to the State of Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Lab for forensic analysis. But when the DNA profile was entered into state and federal databases, no matches were returned. It would be periodically rechecked through the years 2001 through 2011, but without any results. In 2011, Detective Steve Andrews is assigned to Lee's case.
My sergeant came to me one day and plopped these case files on my desk and said, "Hey, you're kind of a go-getter. Why don't you look into this and see what you can do? There's been some advances in DNA, and I know there's some DNA involved in this case. Why don't you see what you can do with this?" It's overwhelming, quite frankly, when you first get this pile of paperwork and boxes and reports basically dumped on you. I just started reading. I started at the front of the case file, and I started reading all the cases, started reading all the reports. I started reading about what all the other previous detectives have done in the case, just to get familiar with the time and the facts and the dates and the names and all the effort that went into the case back then.
In 2018, Council Bluffs crime lab manager Katie Petit joins Steve Andrews on the rotatory case.
DNA's come a long, long ways in the last, even 5 years, but especially in the last, 40 years. We knew that we had a male DNA profile from the sexual assault kit. That profile still had not been identified, despite the fact that it had been entered into the state criminal justice system, which would search against convicted offenders. So we wanted to research and try another route if we could try to identify this unknown male.
The same year Katie joins the team, Council Bluffs Police Captain Todd Wedham sees a television program about the Golden State Killer.
Joseph D'Angelo Jr. committed a string of murders and other crimes in California between 1973 and 1986, and was eventually brought down with the aid of forensic genealogy.
We started talking about it, and he's like, hey, if they can do that, we can do it, right? And I'm like, absolutely, this is a perfect case for that.
In April of 2019, Katie sends a DNA sample to Parabon Nanolabs, a company based in Reston, Virginia, that works with law enforcement on DNA forensics and on technologies for the medical industry.
When the captain released the funding to send our sample in to get started on this, again, that jump-started the whole investigation. And literally, that's when this investigation took off.
Parabon concludes Lee's killer is a male of Northern European descent. In other words, a very large pool.
The lab compares that profile against DNA that has been submitted to family tree companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, in which the clients allow law enforcement to review their DNA profiles.
And then they get a match, but it's with a 6th to an 8th cousin, which leads Parabon to tell investigators their chances of finding a suspect are slim to none.
I was like, okay, so we have a chance. Not a good chance, we have a slim chance, but at least we have a chance.
Parabon reassures the investigators that people submit new kits every day. It's possible one just might eventually come in that will move things forward. For Council Bluffs investigators, it becomes a waiting game.
There wasn't a lot we could do there for a while. It was just waiting for that right person to submit their known DNA profile. We contacted several people that we wanted them to submit because we thought that maybe they would be somehow related or involved. A lot of it was just a waiting game, which is also difficult. You've put all this time into it, and you're hoping that when you submit it, a week later you'll get a phone call and like, hey, we know who it is. But that wasn't the case. It definitely took months, to get to the point where we actually were able to figure out who it was.
Then, in March 2020, Police Captain Todd Wedham opens the email that will change everything. It's from a 20-year-old college student in Pennsylvania who has an interest in genealogy. Could he be key to help solve this cold case and bring justice to the murder of Lee Rotatori? Council Bluffs police turned to a new company in 2019, hoping the latest in DNA forensic techniques might help them identify Lee Rotatori's killer. Comparing that profile against DNA submitted to family tree companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, the lab discovers a match for the DNA profile police sent them, but only in the range of a 6th to 8th cousin of the suspect.
Now it's a waiting game, as investigators hope that as more people research their genealogy and submit their DNA to genealogy databases, that they will get closer to finding the identity of Lee's killer.
Right about this exact same time in our process, we get out of the blue a cold email.
Eric Schubert, a 20-year-old junior history major at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania.
Eric emails Council Bluffs Police Chief Todd Wedham in March 2020 and asks him if he can help with any of their cold cases.
Call it fate, call it divine intervention, call it whatever you want.
Council Bluffs police vet him through other agencies he's assisted, and the city's legal department draws up an agreement with him. Eric gets to work.
Eric came in out of nowhere. He actually solicited us, called us and said, hey, I've read a little bit about this case. I want to help you guys. So kind of came out of nowhere. We didn't expect it.
And we sat down with him and shared our information in our case with him. You know, from that point, it was interesting because, you know, your hopes get up again. You start to ride that roller coaster up. And it was literally, oh my God, probably a week or so later, I get a call from Eric and he says, hey, I found his great-grandparents. He goes, I think we're gonna find him. You know, I was like, ooh, this huge weight being lifted. And, you know, and then I start working that angle and I start contacting distant relatives and requesting DNA samples that I got from family. They were more than helpful. 9 times out of 10, the family was like, if a family member of mine did something like this to somebody, I would want them to take responsibility for what they did. And more than happy to give DNA samples. Eric would send me lists of people. I would send out contact letters. You know, a lot of them were hard to find. You know, at this stage in the game, 40 years later, we ran into a lot of problems. You know, I mean, a lot of people are deceased by now. People have moved, they've changed numbers. I mean, as small as the world is, it's still a very large place. You just can't find everybody. You know, I would reach out to those people. Some of them, you know, I would be able to find. I would get samples back, and then we would start the game over again. I would send those DNA samples in. We would get those results. Eric would plug them into his database of genealogy, and then he would spit out another list of names to me. He goes, okay, that's good. That got us to here. Let's try this. And over the next 2 years, Eric and I did this. It gave you hope, it gave you drive, it gave you a direction, it gave you leads to follow up on, which is what you want. So I started doing this, and we follow these leads.
Using genealogical research, they had zeroed in on a man they believe might have been Lee Rotatori's killer. But there was a surprise in store. The genealogy indicated which family the man belonged to, but his place within the family was not clear.
Eric was able to determine that Nemke was raised by someone other than his biological father, which is what muddied the waters in terms of honing in on his true identity.
Eric called me one day and he goes, he's not who we think he is. He's being raised by somebody that's not really his father. And I'm like, what? And he's like, on paper, our suspect's father is not really his father. He's an illegitimate child of somebody, and that's why our numbers aren't matching up.
Then, out of the blue, the waiting game with Parabon pays off. The lab has flagged a DNA kit that had been submitted by an unknown man, one who had never been approached by the investigators.
The man's profile helps Eric Schubert and Parabon narrow down the suspect pool to 2 brothers. One was too young to have committed the crime in 1982. The other was Thomas O. Freeman.
Both Parabon and Schubert called Council Bluffs police within an hour of each other with a name.
We got an email from Parabon and an email from Eric, both saying, I think we found the guy. We do some research, and lo and behold, we find out that Thomas Oscar Freeman is deceased. And not only is he deceased, we find out he was murdered approximately 2 months after Lee's homicide took place.
Council Bluffs police need to prove Freeman's DNA is a match for the DNA found on Lee.
So the next step is then to try to reach out to family members to try to get a known DNA sample to corroborate our findings. And his brothers were deceased, his parents were deceased. We found out who his true father was. He was deceased. We found that Thomas had a daughter who was still alive. She was living in St. Louis. The Illinois State Police, as part of their investigation into the homicide of Thomas, reached out to her to get a DNA sample. And then we piggybacked off of that investigation and verified the identity of our suspect through his daughter's DNA.
On Friday, February 25th, 2022, Council Bluffs Police Captain Todd Wedham issues a press release announcing detectives have cleared the cold case homicide of Lee Rotatori. They named Thomas Freeman as the source of the suspect DNA found at the crime scene. Thomas Oscar Freeman was a trucker from West Frankfort, Illinois. He was 35 at the time of Lee's murder. Police think he may have killed Lee while passing through on a haul, although his name is not on the motel's register for that night. But who fired 4 bullets into Thomas Freeman's chest in the summer of 1982, just weeks after Lee Rotatori's murder?
Council Bluff detectives and Illinois state troopers begin working together on Freeman's homicide. They don't yet know who shot him, but they do have reason to believe that his death could be related to Lee Rotatori's murder.
Jerry Nemke, when he was released from prison back in 1978, he moved to Carbondale, Illinois, and went to Southern Illinois University. Well, Thomas Oscar Freeman was found buried and dead approximately 15 miles away from that area. Thomas Oscar Freeman was raised in that area and had ties to that area. So Jerry Nemke and Thomas Oscar Freeman both were geographically located in the same vicinity in that same time frame.
Was it possible that Nemke and Freeman had crossed paths in the late 70s while they were both in the area? Early on, Jerry Nemke had been ruled out as a suspect in Lee's murder.
And the first thing that I did in this case after reading the case file was I found her husband at the time, and I wanted his DNA. And everything I read in this case led me to believe that he had to be involved in this somehow. So I found him first and collected it. I sent the detectives from Tampa, Florida out to his house. They collected his DNA, and it was literally almost 3 years later that I finally got the results of that test.
The DNA test came back negative, proving that Lee's husband is not the assailant who stabbed her to death in the Best Western Frontier Lodge motel room on the night of June 25th, 1982. But as Steve Andrews studied the existing case files, Nemke's alibi for the 24th and 25th caught his attention. Jerry Nemke's DNA had proved he was not the one who murdered his wife in 1982. Yet something didn't sit right with Detective Steve Andrews. As Steve Andrews studied the existing case files, Nemke's alibi for the 24th and 25th caught his attention.
In reading through the reports, his alibi was like rock solid. I mean, it was like over the top solid alibi. He had worked the previous evening until 10 p.m. at night. He didn't have to be back to his second job till later in the next day. To me, my thoughts is well, if I'm involved in this, I have to establish some time frame in between that where I'm known and seen. He shows up at Hackley Hospital where Lee was working previously prior to coming to Council Bluffs to return a lab coat. Just apparently out of the clear blue sky, he decided that today, the day that her body is found, before it's found, he needs to show up and return her lab coat to her previous place of employment. Shortly after that, then he makes a special trip out to the stable where Lee's horse is boarded at, where again, he happens to return an item that he tells the lady that owns the stable that Lee wanted her to have this, and then talks to her about Lee and has another appearance with a good close friend of Lee's. He leaves there and then he goes to his job later that afternoon where he has an alibi and he's seen there. He almost went out of his way to establish his whereabouts as not being here.
Jerry Nemke's overly elaborate alibi led Andrews to believe Lee's husband had more involvement in her murder than investigators ever thought.
And then there was Jerry's physical proximity to Freeman at the end of the 70s. Nemke served his time for killing young Chicago waitress Marilyn Duncan at the Menard Correctional Facility located in southern Illinois. After his release in 1978, he attended college in Carbondale, about 26 miles outside West Frankfort, where Freeman lived, and 15 miles from Cobden, where his remains were found.
He was shot 4 times in the chest and buried in a shallow grave within 2 months after Lee is killed. Some people might think that's a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences at this point. Everything I read in this case led me to believe that he had to be involved in this somehow.
Around the time Thomas Freeman was coming into focus as the suspect in Lee's murder, Steve found his name kept coming to mind.
It's like, I know I've heard that name somewhere in this, where I don't know where I've heard this name at. So I dig back into the files again and I reread that in the weeks leading up to June 25th of 1982, when Lee was killed, Jerry had received multiple phone calls from somebody he identified as Tom. That he received 3 phone calls that Jerry wasn't there for, and then he called back and 2 other times and actually spoke to Jerry within days, like on the 23rd, before Lee was killed. The same Tom individual had called back and actually spoke with Lee's husband on the phone. And I remember that from reading those reports. Whether that Tom on the phone is our Tom, again, I can't prove that one way or another, but it's just another one of those coincidences that, you have to draw your own conclusions about.
Nemke died in 2019. Steve recalled reading in the early case files that Lee had an insurance policy with Jerry, named as the beneficiary.
Jerry had recently passed away, and someone that he knew called me and said, "Hey, I got information I'd like to share with you." And I'm always looking for information in reference to this case, so I'm like, shoot. And he says, "I was home on leave several years ago, and I was out to the bar drinking with a friend of Jerry's. And he told me that Jerry was all drunk in a bar one night talking, and he told him that he had hired some guy that he was in prison with to kill his wife so he could collect the insurance money. And not only that, he said he knew when it was going to happen, so he was sure to make sure he established an alibi for the time frame of her death. We know Thomas is deceased. We also know that Jerry is now deceased. Those two men may have taken the secret to Lee's homicide with them to the grave.
And that was one unfortunate part of this, this whole case is we won't ever actually be able to go and, throw him in jail, but at least we know who it is. And I think that is some closure for us. And obviously he can't victimize another person, now, so.
Steve Andrews is quick to praise the investigators who preceded him on Lee's case, working diligently over the years.
The work that they did was unbelievable. I mean, I look back and I read through their reports that they did and all the work that they did, all the people they talked to, the suspects they interviewed, the polygraphs they did, the witnesses that they interviewed, the reaching out to other agencies to look for similar cases with similar MOs, the call records for what they were at that time that they dug into. Again, looking for potential flights coming into town and leaving that may have brought somebody. And once they've exhausted, every option that they had available to them at the time, and every one of the leads that they had followed up to that point led to a dead end.
And the green florist's foam at the crime scene? Its origins remain a mystery.
It was literally the change in technology in the time frame of when this case went cold for them until I picked it up is what made all the difference in the world in this case.
I think anytime we're dealing with a true victim, we want to solve the case. We owe it to them, especially if it's, in a case of a homicide where we can't talk to them, we can't ask them questions. Our goal is to, try to bring justice to the loved ones of this victim.
Lee had a life, she had family, she was a daughter, she was a sister, she was a mother. And it's important for those people.
In a case that spanned 40 years, the diligence and dedication of law enforcement officers, along with tremendous strides in DNA technology, and the help of a young genealogy genius, would finally see the murder of Lee Rotatori solved.